Hello again, Mr. Smith here with 7th Hour U.S. History. Today we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, a very complicated topic. So we're going to look at a lot of maps. We're going to discuss different presidents and the way they dealt with the situation. It seemed like a good idea, but then as time went on, it got messier and messier and ultimately turned into a really bad situation. It all began with World War II, actually. Yeah, that's a long time before Vietnam War, but the roots of the Vietnam War are found in the closing stages of World War II. So we're going to look at that first. So where is Vietnam? It's a long way from the United States. It is south of China and a little bit east of India. And for this reason, it was called Indochina. It was called French Indochina because the French had settled it and colonized it. Well, French Indochina was taken over by the Japanese in World War II. In 1945, when the Japanese were defeated and the area was given its freedom again, there was a group of communists and socialists headed by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Well, Ho Chi Minh and his socialist communists wanted to create a dictatorship in the area. And so the French, who had liberated the area from Japan, began fighting with Ho Chi Minh. That lasted up until around 1954. Around 1954, the French kind of gave up, and the area of French Indochina was divided into four countries: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Vietnam was further divided into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was given to Ho Chi Minh and his communists, and the French militaries left the area. As soon as they did, North Vietnam attacked South Vietnam. The communists wanted to take over the whole region. Well, if you look at the map here, you can see that the northern capital is called Hanoi, capital of North Vietnam, and the southern capital is called Saigon, capital of South Vietnam. So 1954, the French leave the area. U.S. president at the time is Eisenhower. Of course, Eisenhower does everything right and is very smart, and he says the United States military should not get involved in Vietnam. He said it would be a mess. He said we could support the South Vietnamese in their fight against communism. We could lend them some equipment, we could lend them some money, we could give them some advice, but we were not going to risk the lives of young American soldiers over there. That was Eisenhower. Next president, John F. Kennedy, changes the policy. He begins to send thousands of American soldiers into South Vietnam, and Kennedy, as we know, didn't live very long. He was followed by President Johnson, and he sends not thousands, he sends hundreds of thousands of American soldiers into the Vietnam War. This is when things really heat up. This is around 1964, 1965. So there's a lot of action in Vietnam. Vietnam is a very confusing war. Unlike World War II, unlike the Korean War, where you draw a line and you have one army on one side and one army on the other, and they shoot at each other, the Vietnam War was a war primarily of guerrilla tactics. So there was no clear territory, there was no clear front line, there were just groups of soldiers roaming around the country shooting at each other. The war in Vietnam relied heavily on the American side on the use of the helicopter. This was the first war in which helicopters played such an important role. Another tactic of the North Vietnamese was to hide in thick jungles. It was very difficult to find them because the vegetation was so thick, the leaves hid them, which gave way to something called Operation Ranch Hand. And this was an operation by the American military to fly over the forests with airplanes spraying a substance known as Agent Orange. And if you spray a forest with Agent Orange and you come back a couple days later, you will find that the trees have dropped all their leaves. Suddenly there's no leaves on the trees and the enemy has no place to hide. The United States did bomb North Vietnam several times during the war. high altitude bombing. The United States had impressive technology here. This is an airplane known as the B-52, very powerful bomber. The problem was there wasn't much to bomb in North Vietnam. They didn't have a highly developed industry. They didn't have major centers of communication or technology. It was a very decentralized country, a lot of cottage industry, a lot of rice farms. So we could bomb, but there wasn't much to bomb. A different type of bombing is something called napalm, which creates a gigantic burst of fire. This was effective against the North Vietnamese soldiers who were hiding in forested areas. One of the stranger incidents of the war involves a soldier using actually a bow and arrow. This wasn't common, but what did happen once or twice. It was a way to send a flaming arrow into a flammable area where the enemy was hiding, start a fire, and make them run out. So the North Vietnamese continued to attack South Vietnam, hit and run tactics. The Americans were trying to stop it, but at home this war was less and less popular. Why? Why was it not popular? Why were people against it? After all, the idea of stopping a communist dictatorship from subjugating and oppressing people, that seems like a reasonable idea. However, the reasons for the war became muddied, and it wasn't clear at all why we were spending so much time and effort in what should have been a quick and simple task. And the American public was concerned about the numbers of young American soldiers who were dying over there. So the war was unpopular, and President Johnson was unpopular. He had begun his time in office with a great popularity rating, but his popularity fell because of the war. The anger of the people, the anger of the protesters against the war has to be distinguished from the soldiers themselves. The American soldiers were not the people to be criticized. They were simply doing their duty, doing the best they knew how. The blame went at President Johnson. President Johnson knew that he had about zero chance of ever getting reelected. So he didn't even bother to run for reelection in 1968. President Nixon, candidate Nixon at first in 1968, made a great point of promising that if elected, he would end the war. And so he did. Richard Nixon was elected president, and pretty quickly thereafter began to wind up and finally end America's involvement in Vietnam. So Nixon gets credit for bringing an end to this thing. We know Nixon had some other problems that made him not so popular later on, but he actually got a great deal of credit for ending the war. So it was around 1973 that a peace treaty was negotiated between North and South Vietnam, a sort of a ceasefire or an armistice. The United States military could pack up from South Vietnam and go home. But in reality, everybody kind of knew this peace treaty wasn't going to last. And as soon as the United States military had left South Vietnam, then North Vietnam attacked the South, overran it quickly, destroyed it basically, and North and South Korea were united under a brutal communist dictatorship by 1975. And that's basically the story of the Vietnam War. Sad story, sad ending. On a personal note, many of you probably have grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, people you know who were involved in one way or another in that war. You might ask them their story. Somebody who's now maybe 65, 70, 75 years old, but was there and saw it up close and personal. Because this is part of history that impacted the lives of many people in America, many people that you know and interact with. Anyway, that's all for today. See you later. Bye-bye.